Good afternoon and welcome to the second discussion forum hosted by Iranian Americans for Liberty. I am your host, Golsa Sarabi. The topic of today's forum is Snapback Explained. And today we are honored to have as our guest an expert on this particular topic, Mr. Richard Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg is a national security expert and a senior advisor to Foundations for Defense of Democracies. He served as a national security advisor aide in the Trump administration and foreign policy aide to Senator Mark Kirk. He also is a former aide to Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Goldberg, welcome to the program. Can you please give us some introductory remarks?
Absolutely, and I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. For those joining on a weekend, for participating, thank you for being a part of this. Such an important time to talk about this subject, very timely. Just a bit of context before we dive into the substance of Snapback. Sort of how did we get here over the last several months? Well, one of the things to remember is that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which you in the audience know just as much about me on the details, especially of how horrible that deal was to pour billions of dollars of sanctions relief into the Islamic Republic to build it back up after years of sanctions before the Iran nuclear deal, to tear apart the fabric of bipartisanship that was really leading the way in the U.S. Congress to counter the myriad of threats from the Islamic Republic, not only its nuclear program, its ballistic missile programs, its malign activities throughout the Middle East, but also its human rights record and what it does to its own citizens, its own people over many, many decades. And so we actually did something a little bit more than just give Iran billions of dollars in exchange for some limited constraints on its nuclear program for a temporary amount of time. What the United States and the other world powers did was they went into the UN Security Council and they said, let's add additional incentives for Iran to continue to comply with this deal. And those incentives would be that over several years, all the different restrictions and sanctions of the UN Security Council, those that had been built up over several years because of the threats from the Islamic Republic, would start to expire. And so long as Iran was behaving itself, was not exceeding the limits, again, the temporary limits of the nuclear deal, it would at some point achieve these expiration dates that we call sunsets, the sunsets of the JCPOA. These are actually in the JCPOA, but they're actually legally put into a Security Council resolution because these restrictions were put in place by the Security Council. They can only be relieved, they can only expire by a vote of the Council. And so that's what the Council did. And that resolution 2231 terminated a whole bunch of previous UN Security Council resolutions that had established restrictions and sanctions on Iran over time. And the first of those restrictions that comes upon us for expiration is the International Conventional Arms Embargo on Iran. This is the restriction on anyone selling advanced conventional arms. That's a wide range of weapon systems, aircraft, tanks, naval systems, etc., to the Islamic Republic, as well as the Islamic Republic being able to transfer such systems outside of its borders. And we know, of course, its track record of transferring advanced weapons, missiles, and other things to terrorist proxies throughout the Middle East, whether Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. And so in order to stop this arms embargo from expiring, the Trump administration began a 2-year campaign of diplomacy to get a new resolution to extend this arms embargo out. Because what people don't realize and didn't think about was when President Trump took America out of the Iran deal in 2018 and reimposed U.S. sanctions, he ended America's participation in the Iran deal, but he didn't end the deal and certainly didn't end the Security Council resolution where these restrictions were set to expire. That can only happen in 2 ways. A new resolution that changes the old one, extends out timelines, or the snapback mechanism, which we'll talk about. So Secretary Pompeo went ahead and said, okay, let's try the first as a matter of diplomacy to work with our allies, to work with Russia and China, see if we can't come up with some way to extend these restrictions. We've seen over the last year especially what happens when Iran decides that it doesn't like certain geopolitics. Rather than using diplomacy, rather than negotiations, it attacks its neighbors, it attacks Americans. We've seen attacks against ships in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Americans, and British troops in Iraq and elsewhere. And so the case is pretty obvious. We can't allow the arms embargo to expire. We need all nations to agree. We certainly are not going to allow any state to give this dictatorship any more advanced weapons, sophisticated weapons. They obviously have a range of weapon systems they'd like to shop from, especially from Russia and China, things that they can't produce themselves. And the matter of record is obviously crazy for the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism that's shown it's willing to attack its neighbors, to attack international maritime vessels, to attack American troops in Iraq, to allow them to acquire these systems. Congress, in a bipartisan act, remember this, it's been a while since we've seen a lot of bipartisanship on Iran, but on this issue we see bipartisanship. Nearly 400 members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, even Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, signed a letter to Secretary Pompeo saying, please do all you can to extend this arms embargo. We cannot let it expire. And so the United States went through the motions, did all these things, really tried. Brian Hook, the special representative for Iran, traveled the world, I think visited 30 countries on this issue. And what happened in the end? Once the United States brought forward a resolution to extend the arms embargo and deal with the most imminent crisis of these sunsets, where there's so much consensus with our partners and allies, where we see the Gulf nations, Israel, those who are actually threatened in the Middle East, screaming out, please, 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 Security Council, extend these restrictions. Russia and China obviously oppose this because they want to sell the weapon systems that they have to Iran. And very unfortunately, our European allies cowered, decided to stay neutral. And neutrality on this issue really means being for the expiration of this restriction. But that's not the last say on this, as we'll talk about. There is a snapback provision that's built into the Security Council resolution in order to prevent this arms embargo from expiring, and frankly, to hold Iran accountable for not just its dangerous, malicious acts and violence in the region, but for its nuclear misconduct, for all the different threats that it poses with ballistic missiles and other malign activities. A way to restore all of the restrictions long-term that are set to expire in the future as well, to go back in time to 2010, when we had a different Security Council resolution in place that called on Iran to halt all of its enrichment, to stop any testing of ballistic missiles, that no country would be allowed to supply Iran with advanced weapons or missile parts. That's the snapback. Iran currently is in violation of all of its commitments under the nuclear deal. And the plain text of the resolution says the United States can invoke that, can trigger it, can restore all the past restrictions. And really, there's no other choice for the United States but to go through that at this point. Otherwise, Iran, Russia, China would have an uncontested path to a new generation of advanced weapon systems flooding the Middle East.
Got it. Thank you so much for your remarks. If it's okay with you, we're going to get to some questions.
Yes.
As you said, and as of this week, the process known as snapback of previous UN sanctions against the Islamic Republic has been initiated by President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, as you've mentioned. Would you please kindly tell us a little about the mechanism and how it works?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting, a little bit unprecedented, unconventional, yet ingenious mechanism that was built into the resolution.
Right.
Originally an idea from a French diplomat, then expanded on by the US delegation. The idea here, and you can see all the quotes, I've tweeted them out in the past, from President Obama, Secretary Kerry, former Treasury Secretary Lew, Wendy Sherman, who negotiated the agreement, all of them coming forward to sell the JCPOA to Congress and the American people, guaranteeing us that we had this snapback mechanism. What it meant was, and what they said, which was right at the time, is that if every other country in the world wanted to keep the JCPOA going, wanted to keep Resolution 2231 going, wanted to allow the arms embargo to expire in October of 2020, but the United States objected, and the United States said, whoa, Iran is doing bad things. They are exceeding their nuclear limits of the JCPOA. We are not going to allow them to have their nuclear cake and eat their sunsets too, as you will, that we're going to trigger the snapback mechanism. What the resolution says is that any of the council members who were quote unquote JCPOA participants, and it names what that means, China, Russia, France, UK, Iran, the European Union, and the United States as a definition, can send a letter to the council saying Iran is in significant non-performance of its commitments under the JCPOA. And once that is received in the council, a 30-day clock starts. In order to stop that 30-day clock, in order to stop the snapback, and what we mean by snapback is the snapping back into place of the prior resolutions. So all the restoration of the restrictions and the sanctions from 2010 and before come back into place. That's the snapback. The only way to stop that from happening is to pass a resolution in the council that says, we don't want the snapback. And that resolution has to pass within the 30 days after the complaint. If it doesn't pass, snapback happens. How do you pass something in the Security Council? It has to pass. It has to have a certain number of majority votes already, 9 votes. But it also cannot be vetoed by one of the permanent members of the Security Council. So the United States is a permanent member. It can veto a resolution that seeks to stop the snapback. And if it does, the resolution hasn't passed, and therefore there is no snapback. Why is this sort of untraditional? And it goes to the core of what we were promised, the American people were promised by President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, and others, is that you have to sort of put aside the views of the other 4 permanent members at that point. That this is the United States will. We don't like what Iran is doing. We allege it's in significant non-performance. We are complaining, and 30 days later, the snapback will happen. And even if the rest of the permanent members and the rest of the council disagree, the United States gets to use its veto right as sort of this reverse veto, that something happens because we veto it. Usually you veto something to stop it from happening. This allows us to veto something to make something happen. And so, Ambassador Sherman and others, have said this was going to be our right, that no other country can stop us. And that's exactly what we are doing now, where the rest of the world seems fine to, let the arms embargo expire in October. Russia and China want to sell advanced arms to Iran. UK, France, Germany seem like they just are unwilling to show any courage to get in the way of that. And so we have this right that's built into the Security Council resolution, the snapback right. And if we don't exercise that right, then what exactly have we done here? We are now complicit in allowing these restrictions to expire, even though Iran is clearly in violation of its own commitments, and the snapback is fully eligible to happen.
Thank you. So there is a confusion about US sanctions that are already in place and UN sanctions that are to be potentially implemented as a result of the snapback process. What is the difference between the 2 types of sanctions, and would it make much of a difference if UN sanctions are implemented on top of what is already in place?
So it's an important distinction. U.S. sanctions that were reimposed back in 2018, and again, even more in 2019, and more even here in 2020, These are U.S. economic financial sanctions that have to do with U.S. law. And we are deciding on our own as a sovereign nation that we deem that there is a national emergency based on some threat in the world, in this case, the Islamic Republic of Iran, for a variety of reasons, their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program, their sponsorship of terrorism, and their human rights abuses, all comprise the reasons why we view the Islamic Republic as a threat to the United States. Long-standing bipartisan view that that is so. And because of that, the president has issued executive orders that order the imposition of sanctions on Iran for a variety of different economic reasons. And they hit different economic sectors, the banking sector, the shipping sector, the energy sector, et cetera. Also, all the waivers that were put in place by Congress, the waivers that were put in place by the Obama administration for laws that were passed by Congress before the Iran deal have been withdrawn. And so, remember, the Iran deal didn't get passed as a treaty in the Senate, one of its greatest flaws, and one of the reasons why you can just have 4 years of one president and 4 years of the next and go back and forth, right? Europeans hate that and they complain about it. How can you have a foreign policy that changes every 4 years? But that's actually exactly what happens in a democracy. And so if you didn't submit it as a treaty, and sometimes a treaty would come with different rules and expectations where it might overrule and repeal other laws in the past at the same time. And that never happened. So all the US laws, all the sanctions laws passed by Congress were still in effect throughout the JCPOA. They were simply suspended in time temporarily every 6 months due to waivers issued by the Obama administration and at the early part, the Trump administration. Once President Trump made the decision to leave the deal, he simply took back those waivers and then started adding on additional sanctions by executive order. And what that says is that if you want to do business with America, you have to choose. You have to choose whether you're doing business with the Iranian banks. And if you do, your choice, we can't stop you. You just can't use American banks. You know, if you want to do business with this shipping sector of Iran, if you want to do business with its nuclear program, you can do those things. You just don't get any right to use American things in return. And so we're just putting choice to these nations. We're not sourcing it to a Security Council resolution. We're sourcing it to the power of American sovereignty and law for who gets to be eligible to use the American banking system, the American market for exports, et cetera. The UN have these multilateral sanctions regimes where it calls upon all members of UN member states, all members of the United Nations, to abide by these restrictions. Now, over time, some of these restrictions across all the different UN Security Council resolutions with different countries and different functions sometimes aren't complied with, sometimes they are complied with. That is the nature of the United Nations sometimes. But it does provide this sort of overarching view of international legitimacy. Or if you're on the target end of the sanctions, the opposite effect, a delegitimizing effect, a cast upon you as a rogue actor that is under a cloud from the United Nations Security Council because of your behavior. And that's something that means a lot to the Islamic Republic. The idea that they would be subject to binding Security Council resolutions and restrictions because they are doing something wrong, because they are a rogue state. That is something they sought to get out from under as part of the Iran deal, which is really the crux of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, that we're sort of going to close the door on all the questions that were never answered about their nuclear program. We're going to water down restrictions on their ballistic missile program, so when they test, they're not really doing anything wrong. We just wish they weren't testing ballistic missiles, and so on. And over time, they'll get access to conventional arms with full legitimacy. They'll get access to missile parts with full legitimacy. They import these things sometimes illicitly on the black market, but you don't see the Chinese government acknowledging it. You don't see the Russian government actively selling out of their major defense firms any of these products. You might have some black market people like Carl Lee in China that sell missile parts. But by and large, with something this big and under such a microscope, states do abide by such restrictions. And so in order to add additional political pressure onto the Islamic Republic as part of the maximum pressure campaign, it's important that we continue to delegitimize the regime's conduct, the very nature of the regime itself, that it is not okay to provide conventional arms to a regime that conducts itself in the way that the Islamic Republic does. It's simply not okay as a matter of international legitimacy and norms. And so that's a big part of the reason why we have UN Security Council resolutions and why it's important to use the snapback to put that cloud back onto the Islamic Republic, to put that warning sign to all member states that there's something wrong going on there in Tehran, that this is not a normal country, and our behavior towards it cannot be normal either.
Thank you. I know you have been asked this question numerous times, but just to set the record straight once and for all, the Islamic Republic, as well as China and Russia, claim since the US has left the nuclear deal, it cannot trigger snapback sanctions. Do you agree with that?
No, I do not agree with that. Some of our European allies have decided for political expediency to take that position as well, it seems. But you have to be grounded by the four corners of a UN Security Council resolution to make interpretations and make decisions. Otherwise, you basically turn the Security Council into a circus and something where, you know, it just depends on what we feel today as far as whether or not a Security Council resolution says what it says, or whether we think it really should say something else, so we'll decide it says something else. The precedent that sets is one that will cascade over time, and frankly, with a lot of people in the United States who already are pretty cynical about the United Nations, as you know, this will only feed into that cynicism. There are a lot of people in the US who would say the UN is corrupt, we're wasting so much money. They point to all the different UN agencies where they see China taking over. They see Russia trying to impede us. They see rumors of corruption, cyber attacks that are covered up, whistleblowers not listened to, the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity in some of these areas. It's obviously a huge concern that Congress has taken up for a long time, and so have past administrations. But everyone sort of comes back to say, well, at least there's a Security Council, and we're a permanent member of that council, and big decisions can't happen without us weighing in. And yes, Russia and China keep using their veto, and things like Syria never get addressed because of Russia's veto power. And that already starts hurting the credibility of the council. But we still have our own veto, right? We still have our rights when Security Council resolutions say so. If the council gets to just decide that the United States doesn't have those rights anymore, why are we entertaining this circus any further? I think a lot of people, especially in the Republican side, but even bipartisan, would start asking those questions. And maybe this doesn't play out tomorrow. Maybe it doesn't play out in 4 years. But over time, this will become really part of the consciousness in the debate over the UN. In the resolution, it says that the United States is a party that can trigger the snapback. It just says it. If the intention of the resolution had been to create a contingency where the definition of a party that can use the snapback would change if that party did something, it would say so. And so the controversy comes from one paragraph in this resolution, 2231, paragraph 10, where it lays out all the different parties who were the original JCPOA participants, and then puts the list in parentheses and in quotes and calls them JCPOA participants. And then as we see in the paragraphs that come, it recycles that term in the parentheses, JCPOA participant states, and allow, just, for shortening the use of words, instead of having to say Russia, China, UK, US, EU, blah, 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 you just say JCPOA participants, and you recycle that in the next paragraph, just like any legal document you've ever seen, where there's a bunch of names and a parentheses, it says plaintiffs or defendants or the parties. If you've ever done a contract, this is how it's done in every contract you've ever seen. This is called a term of art, and it just gets used as a definition. You see the original parentheses, what came before it, and that's what that term means wherever it's used throughout the document. We are supposed to believe here that, according to the Russians, the Chinese, and the Europeans, that that's not really what this was. This was just, recognizing that these were the people who were in the JCPOA at the time. And you're just supposed to know that if anybody leaves the JCPOA in the future, the definition no longer applies to them. But that's not how contracts work. That's not how legal documents work. You don't get just to say, okay, well, common sense says that doesn't apply anymore because we've changed the context. If that's how it worked, we would have no rule of law. We'd have no system of law. We'd have no legal documents. Everything would be up for grabs. And so this is really going to the heart of what it means to have a binding Security Council resolution, the fact that it's the United States under attack, a permanent member, and even further, the procedural maneuvers that are being rumored that the Russians and Chinese are pushing and that the Europeans might be complicit with, would try to evade further U.S. powers at the UN Security Council by assuming that the U.S. complaint is invalid from the start, putting the onus on the United States to try to convene a meeting by procedural means. Whereas the precedent of the Council would be, from the straight reading of the resolution and the U.S. contending that it is a participant for the purpose of snapback, putting the onus on Russia and China to offer a motion, to say that the U.S. complaint is invalid. They don't want to do that because the U.S. has rights as a permanent member. We get to veto that resolution. We get to demand that the complaint move forward to the end of the 30 days. So this is a lot of Chinese, Russian versus U.S., big power competition type stuff playing out. The Europeans, because of their emotional attachment to the JCPOA, are helping their own adversaries and the U.S. adversaries in doing this, but they're also undermining the credibility of the Council. They're undermining their own power in the UK and France as fellow permanent members. Frankly, the Russians and the Chinese are also undermining their own power as P5 members, but I think in this case they don't really care because they are the revisionist powers in the world. They are the ones that are always trying to just attack and degrade the United States and the traditional Western powers. Anything that creates confusion and chaos in the international system works to their advantage. And so we hope that in the next days ahead, the Europeans will have a change of heart and they will see that even if they really disagree emotionally with our decision to snap back, that they have to allow the precedent of the Security Council, the rules of the Security Council, to remain intact to preserve our own power as P5 members, and to allow this to play out as it should. We could talk about that process, but the basics here are there's 10 days from the time that we submit a complaint. In that 10 days, any member can submit a resolution to ignore the U.S. complaint. On the 10th day, if no one else has, the president of the Security Council is mandated to submit that resolution. Once that resolution has been submitted, it must go to a vote of the Council. And again, that's the resolution that the U.S. can veto. That resolution is trying to stop the snapback, and we can veto it to force the snapback. And ultimately, even if China and Russia and Europeans play all these games and change the precedent of the Security Council and undermine the legitimacy of the Council for the foreseeable future, ultimately it still says in the resolution, if there's no resolution that passes to stop the snapback after 30 days, snapback happens. And the worst case scenario here is there is now a cloud over whether or not it is legal under international law for Iran to import conventional arms. Had we done nothing, had we just sat there and not snapped back, there would be no cloud. It would be pretty obvious that Iran can import advanced conventional arms under the expiration of the restriction in 2231. Now there is doubt. Quite frankly, there shouldn't be doubt. It should be absolutely recognized that they are not allowed to. And hopefully that will be the outcome still after the 30 days.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask, from the point that the snapback mechanism is initiated, it will take some time for the finalization at the UN. And I was going to ask you about the process of the snapback in terms of what time frame are we looking at, but I guess like you kind of answered. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so we have the first 10 days, and then we have the 30-day clock, and that's basically it. And remember, October 18th is when the arms embargo was scheduled to expire. And so you had to make sure that your 30-day clock is started before that point, because interesting that the 2231 thought about a lot of different contingencies. One of the contingencies it thought of was, well, what if the arms embargo expires in 2020, but snapback happens in 2023? What happens to all the arms contracts that Iran signs with Russia and China in that 3-year period? Those are actually grandfathered in. They are not subject to the snapback restrictions once they are restored. And so you want to make sure we can be sure that there's going to be a lot of contracts that just suddenly are signed at midnight on October 18th. And we're going to see all kinds of propaganda from the regime and from the Russians and Chinese of promises. But we want to make sure that those promises are always now under a cloud, that they are a violation of international law. And therefore, if the Trump administration, as it has promised to do so, takes action, executive action, to enforce the Security Council resolutions that were restored, it will be doing so with greater international legitimacy. And the power of U.S. sanctions now are not just because we feel a threat, but they are also in line with international norms and law.
So if the UN sanctions are resumed as a result of the snapback, do you think that would be the last nail in the coffin of the Iran nuclear deal? Because Europeans have claimed that they are determined to preserve the deal. So do you think if the UN sanctions are resumed, Europeans, Russia, and China would comply with them?
So technically, the deal exists so long as the deal exists and there's any party who says the deal still exists, right? It's this weird, non-binding political agreement that's sitting out there among a handful of parties. And if they just want to get together for coffee every few months in Vienna, they can still claim they're in some deal. But what does it really mean, right? The deal has been dead for a while. We just haven't had the funeral. And so what matters here is there a resurrection of prior Security Council resolutions to stop the sunsets from going forward? And is there legitimacy for that? And will the United States take its own unilateral action, and perhaps partner nations who support the snapback take their actions as well to enforce it and to deter Russia or China from saying, we don't recognize the snapback, we're still going to sell weapons? And that's exactly what Secretary Pompeo has vowed to do. It's really sort of up to Iran if they want to maintain the fig leaf that there is a JCPOA. They've wanted to for their own political warfare ambitions. They like the idea of meeting with the Europeans and having a party that blasts the United States. But in the end, this is still a regime that is running out of money due to the maximum pressure campaign. Will now have a cloud of international questionable legitimacy over any sort of arms deal that it thinks it's going to get from Russia or China. It will face the power of the United States acting to enforce what it believes is a justifiable snapback to stop any of those arms transfers from ever occurring, using all the available tools of the U.S. government to do that. And so they will not reap the benefits of the sunsets. Now, if there's a new administration, if Joe Biden wins the election and decides, you know what, I'm going to reverse all this, I'm going to say we didn't snap back, or let's agree to bring back Resolution 2231 by a vote, and we'll start going to your meetings in Vienna again at the JCPOA, and we're going to lift all the sanctions. Ultimately, no one can stop him from doing that. However, the market, the private sector market, will have to keep in the back of their minds now the idea that there could be a pendulum swing again in 4 more years. And if there is, are we really going to go through what we just went through between Obama to Trump? Are we going to reinvest in Iran just to have U.S. sanctions come back again, to have to scramble and get out? Are we going to enter into arms deals with Iran and put our international arms market at risk if 4 years from now, Senator Tom Cotton or Secretary Mike Pompeo or Senator Ted Cruz or Vice President Pence or former Ambassador Nikki Haley, if they're president next and they say, no, we snapped back 4 years ago, none of this is credible. U.S. policy is you're in violation and our sanctions are back, and we aren't even going to approve you for any sort of retroactivity because you're already been in violation of a Security Council resolution. That creates all kinds of question marks for the market. And it's what my colleague Mark Dubowitz calls the sanctions wall of deterrence. And I think this is just one more factor in building that wall.
So based on what you're saying, let's go back to the United States obligation to the JCPOA. Does or did the U.S. have a legal obligation to remain in the deal?
Easiest question, no. The first paragraph, the first 2 paragraphs of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 make it clear that implementing the JCPOA is something the Security Council encourages, it urges, but it does not mandate. It mandates that you respect the U.S. right to snap back. It actually does not mandate that the U.S. implement the JCPOA. That's the international law perspective. U.S. law, all U.S. sanctions were still in place statute-wise, as we talked about. They were just on temporary waivers from the Obama administration. President Obama decided not to submit the deal as a treaty, which would have to therefore go through a lot of procedures and processes to ever try to get out of a treaty, which we've seen the Trump administration do in other contexts. And so we're not in violation of a treaty. We never signed a treaty. We never submitted it for ratification. We're not in violation of a Security Council resolution. We decided to cease participating in a non-binding political agreement. This is actually the JCPOA from a legal standard lower than an executive agreement where a president or a secretary of defense signs a bilateral deal with another country. That's actually a signed executive agreement. Case in point where something like that happened and the next president decided to rip it up. The Bush administration, late second term, signed missile defense agreements with Poland and the Czech Republic as part of a global missile defense architecture that it was building to counter the Iranian threat and others. And the Obama administration came in as part of its reset with Russia, the Russia reset, and to show Putin how great our relationship could be and how missile defense is not pointed towards Russia, the Obama administration decided to get out of both of those executive agreements with Poland and the Czech Republic. We did worse things to our Polish allies at the time on the 70th anniversary of its invasion, which you can go Google. And then we offered to bring Russia into our missile defense architecture and show them our most sensitive missile defense data, which Congress thankfully blocked from happening. My point is to say that getting out of something that doesn't even have the legal stature of that bilateral agreement with Poland certainly doesn't have anything to do with the UN Security Council resolution or a treaty, is something very simple that any president can do.
Thank you. I know you've mentioned a little about this when you were talking your remarks in the beginning of the forum, that there are some people and some policy analysts in Washington, D.C. who support the Islamic Republic deny that there are two separate pathways by which Snapback can be initiated, one within the framework of the JCPOA and the other through UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Do you agree with them?
I don't. Those who may follow me on Twitter, and thank you for all who are on the line who retweet me often. I see the correlation in the sign up for this event and a lot of my followers, so thank you. You'll see a thread I just posted before this webinar where I discussed this in detail. The Security Council resolution encourages parties to use the JCPOA's Joint Commission to resolve disputes. Doesn't mandate it, again. This is a point that is actually conceded by one of the pro-JCPOA legal scholars who's put out some counterpoints to my own to try to cloud the issue further. He sort of admits that there are two different kinds of paragraphs in a UN Security Council resolution. There are mandatory ones, not binding provisions, and non-binding ones. You can tell by the initial words of the paragraph. Calls upon, non-binding. Encourages, non-binding. Urges, non-binding. Decides is your key that it's a binding paragraph. And so just like it is not binding on Iran to halt testing of its missiles under the resolution, it used to be, and it will be again after Snapback, it calls upon Iran to halt that testing, non-binding. Same exact language that's being urged here to use the JCPOA to settle your disputes. But then immediately goes to a binding paragraph that lays out how to trigger the snapback by going to the Security Council directly, which is the obvious way of telling us there are two paths here. And legally, because there are two independent documents, you can go through either path. Now, the United States is no longer party to the JCPOA, and therefore it's given up its rights of the JCPOA. So it can't go to the Joint Commission, it can't sit in the Joint Commission, it can't use its dispute resolution mechanism. That's quite appropriate, as the Europeans and others have pointed out. We've lost that right to snapback, per se, by pulling out of the deal. But that doesn't give up our rights at the Security Council within a binding Security Council resolution, within one of its binding provisions, where it states the United States has a right. And remember, while we have removed ourselves from the JCPOA and therefore have forfeited our rights in the Joint Commission, we've never removed ourselves or violated the actual Security Council resolution. In fact, the United States has convened the Security Council multiple times to urge nations to enforce 2231 after pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. That is such a key fact to remember, that we have continued to urge nations to stop allowing Iran to transfer arms outside its borders. We've talked about all the different examples of where we think Iran is violating the resolution, calling for the Sanctions Committee to enforce its rules. That shows that we have never violated 2231. In fact, we've supported 2231. So the idea that we would have forfeited our rights to snapback pursuant to the resolution, using the resolutions mechanism, is simply fabricated propaganda from those who want to try to continue to keep the JCPOA alive.
Thank you. Al Jazeera ran a story on August 16th supporting the claim made by European Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell in that the US cannot implement snapback sanctions because the US withdrew from the JCPOA. What are your thoughts on that, and why have we have our European allies turned their backs on us?
Yeah, so the first part of this is sort of tying back to what I just said, which is,
yes,
Borrell would be correct. We can't use the JCPOA's mechanism. not correct that we can't use the Security Council resolution. And it gets actually a little bit cuter, a little funnier, a little bit more in your face to the Europeans. Actually, the European Union has no standing to trigger snapback at the Security Council under the resolution. The United States does, however, because it takes the definition, JCPOA participants, and then adds on a modifier, state. And so what that means is you have to be a state to send a letter to the Security Council. It could be any of the original parties, but not the European Union. So it's quite funny for Borrell to lecture us on who has eligibility and standing to file a complaint when Borrell himself has no standing to file a complaint under 2231. Why are they doing this? Well, unfortunately, the diplomatic establishment of many of these European countries, and certainly the EU, have shifted their views and policies a long time ago to be very supportive of the Islamic Republic. And they may not say this, they may not admit this, but when you have a discussion with them privately, when you have a diplomatic discussion, it's quite obvious that they simply do not see the Islamic Republic as the same threat that we do. They simply don't. They sort of subscribe to this underlying thesis of the JCPOA that many in the Obama administration had, which was we simply just are misunderstood here. They have grievances that go back to Mossadegh. This is about respect. They have credible fears in the region from missiles in their neighbors' countries, in Israel. Their nuclear program, they see other countries with a nuclear program. Israel has a nuclear program. These are all very rational, legitimate things that they're doing. We just need to stop being the aggressor here. We need to create dialogue and understanding, and then everything will be okay. And if it just means paying them as much as possible to stop doing bad things, that's what we have to do. Several of these diplomats openly call it an appeasement policy because that's what it is. They don't view that as some sort of a negative statement. That's just a statement of fact to them. It is an appeasement policy. And they truly believe this. Now, there is sometimes a disconnect between the leader level and the foreign policy establishment and the foreign office or the diplomats. And you sometimes really need to go to the top to get the leader to intervene. Now, Macron, he's all in. He's pro-JCPOA. He believes it. Merkel as well. I think, frankly, for Merkel and for the Germans, this is about money. When you looked at the trade data during the JCPOA, the Germans were leading the way. You look at the illicit data now. You look at where parts come from, engineering trade, etc. Germany's all over that. And so, unfortunately, I think that's really what it's about. And in the EU itself, this is just this, the Americans just don't know what they're doing, and the Iranians are not the problem, the Americans are. And we see that just sort of general Middle East perspective across the board when it comes to Israel issues, Iran issues, other issues as well. It's depressing. It leads to news stories that allow our detractors to say, oh, America's isolated. Okay, well, we're isolated trying to, call out one of the worst evils in the world. If that makes us isolated, then so be it. I would rather be standing on principle and moral courage and tell my children one day that that's what we did, rather than allowing, this evil to continue to emerge, this sponsor terrorism throughout the world, to take billions of dollars, foment wars, to treat its people the way it does. There's right and wrong. And if we want to stand on right and our European allies choose the wrong side, that's their prerogative, but history will judge them.
Yes, absolutely. Recently, the UN Security Council rejected a US proposal to extend their arms embargo on Iran, and many European policy experts are considering this a major blow to America's efforts to ensure Iran doesn't obtain a nuclear weapon. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the original overview, and we got to just remember that Secretary Pompeo went through the motions, and just go through the motions has a a meaning that sounds like they weren't doing something substantively just for show. I don't mean that. I actually mean that they went through 2 years of diplomacy motions to try to get a Security Council resolution passed, fully well knowing, I would assume, that Russia and China were going to veto it in the end. That resolution was never going to pass. Just wasn't. The Russians and the Chinese want to sell advanced arms to Iran. And so long as they veto the resolution, that happens, right, with international legitimacy. The fact that the Europeans decided to say over several months that they opposed the arms embargo ending, but then stay neutral on a vote to extend the arms embargo is, an unfortunate political win for Iran. But it's really just a morally, huge question mark that emerges in our own relations with Europe to say, why would you do that? Why would you tell us over and over again, we can't let this arms embargo expire? You know that Russia and China is going to veto. Why not force them to veto? Why do you need to stay neutral to allow the resolution to die? So maybe this is great power competition. Maybe this has to do with Chinese and Russian influence over some of our allies. And it's something we need to investigate and really discuss, how our bilateral relationship needs to shift to make sure that it's U.S. influence that wins over Chinese and Russian influence. That's a big deal. Maybe it's just they tell us one thing and they do another. Maybe they are just so morally compromised in their love affair with the Islamic Republic that there's no saving them. I don't know what the answer is there. But it's unfortunate that the resolution died the way it did. But it's also important to realize it was going to die from a veto from Russia and China no matter what. But we had to go through that exercise to demonstrate there is no other way to extend the embargo other than the snapback. And by the way, Iran could have made all of these, things go away. They could have removed the possibility of snapback by not breaching their own commitments. And it's not just the enrichment of uranium that we've seen and the production of heavy water that we've seen, their testing of centrifuges, the reopening, restarting of enrichment at Fordo. It's also the open questions at the IAEA right now, where the IAEA has discovered some materials that came back positive for processed uranium, and they've discovered some evidence of nuclear sites that were never disclosed. And they're saying, let us into the sites. Where did this material come from? Where is it now? What are these satellite photos that we've seen? What are you hiding? And have you been hiding this throughout the JCPOA? This is a massive breach of trust. It's a massive breach of your fundamental nuclear obligations. They could be answering all those questions for the last almost 2 years. They haven't. They have created the opportunity for the U.S. to snap back. And frankly, every country should be supporting the snapback because of their conduct.
Thank you. Last question, and if you have any time, I'm going to take any questions from the audience. As you're aware, Ambassador Bolton wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal basically saying, or at least everyone thought he did, that the US has already left the JCPOA and therefore cannot initiate the snapback process. He also appeared on BBC Persian to discuss and defend his claims. I won't ask you if you agree or disagree with him, but what are your general thoughts on Mr. Bolton's assertions?
So obviously, Ambassador Bolton is a very brilliant statesman and lawyer, a competent diplomat, has done a lot of work in government for many, many years. He's also very skilled at making an argument and finding arguments to bolster his argument at opportune times, which is also a political skill of those who have been in the game for a long time. And what I'll say before I get to it is he obviously comes from a very similar emotional commitment, a moral commitment to stopping all of the illicit malign activities of the Islamic Republic and helping enable one day the vision that we have throughout the United States, a bipartisan commitment as enshrined in U.S. law to promote the free, democratic government of the future in Iran for all the Iranian people to be treated with dignity and respect as they deserve and as is mandated by the Declaration of Human Rights. With all that being said, I respectfully disagree with the ambassador. His larger opposition, his main central opposition to snapback, is actually a rehash of his opposition in 2015 in a New York Times column at the time 2231 was being debated. And he opposes the mechanism itself. He opposes the mechanism itself because of how I described it earlier, this reverse veto, this idea that you can engineer a way where you can force something to happen over the objections of permanent members of the Security Council. You can build into this resolution with a one-time vote future actions that are no longer subject to the permanent member veto. And that's what the snapback is, right? We voted once proactively on 2231, and now we have this built-in mechanism where if the US wants it to happen, it happens, and if Russia, China, France, UK don't want it to happen, it doesn't matter. Their veto doesn't apply here. It reverses the permanent member veto. And he thinks this is just bad precedent, that this evades the permanent member veto. It should never have been allowed in the resolution, and we should do all we can to oppose its use, to delegitimize the resolution, and to ensure we never pass a resolution like this again. He may be right. I see the merits of his argument on why you would oppose this process and how it undermines the permanent veto right. The problem, however, is the debate was lost in 2015. The resolution exists. Ignoring the resolution is not going to prevent it from replicating itself in the future. Not using it is not going to make America safer when the arms embargo is about to expire. Ironically, America's using the snapback accomplishes two great Bolton objectives. Number one, it destroys 2231, right? It's like a self-destruct button for the resolution. So bye-bye 2231 that you hated. We're going back to 2010. And number two, the Russians and the Chinese are so apoplectic that we're using it, they're never going to allow this sort of mechanism to happen again. Because the chaos that we are now seeing happen is a byproduct of the mechanism itself. And it's truly a reflection that we were lied to by the Obama administration when we were told that we had an airtight snapback mechanism in place, that no one would ever be able to stop us. Because really what we're seeing play out right now, they have a little bit of a communications advantage. It's hard to explain how a term JCPOA participant can still apply if you're not a lawyer, if you haven't worked in legal documents, if nobody's explained the details to you. It sounds hokey. So the argument against the US right now makes sense on its face without knowing the details. If the terminology had been green frogs, right, and that was the term of art to represent all the countries, and it said that any green frog state could trigger the snapback, no one would dispute that America remains a green frog state because we're defined in the resolution as a green frog state. This is only happening because it's JCPOA. And so the bottom line here is that in 2015, in 2016, in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, if the rest of the council didn't want to snap back, if the Europeans wanted to keep the JCPOA alive and the Russians and the Chinese wanted to keep it, they would have come up with some other legal argument. They would have said some other reason makes our complaint invalid. So it really doesn't matter whether or not we were in the JCP or we weren't. This whole thing is now in dispute because the Russians and the Chinese have come to the same conclusion that Bolton came to in 2015. We can't let America do this. We don't want them to. And so we've decided to sort of just blow up this resolution, keeping the parts that are good for Russia and China and Iran, sort of discarding the parts that are good for America. And that's the part to me that is really horrifying for the future of the council. And that's where the UK and France need to take a deep breath and say, whoa, okay, we should never have done this resolution. We created this problem by establishing sunsets and creating the snapback. We never thought of all the contingencies of what could happen. But this is what the resolution says. better for us to let this play out, let the snapback happen, support the Americans, don't let Russia and China completely blow up the Security Council, and in the future, we won't do this again.
Thank you so much, Richard. I want to say we really appreciate your time for today. And if there is any closing remarks that you would like to address, we would love to hear that.
No, I'll just say, you know, it's unfortunate at times like this that we get wrapped around the axle on these, you know, minute details, snapback and the nuclear program and JCPOA and all these things, because we have to go through this. We have to know the details. We have to fight these legal battles. We have to fight these political battles. But they are ultimately a big distraction from the larger point and the larger mission. And that is that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a great threat to international peace and security. It was before the JCPOA, it was during the JCPOA, and it will be so long as it continues. And the reason for that is ultimately the same reason why the Soviet Union was a threat. A nation that treats its own people with disrespect and without dignity is never going to respect the rights of its neighbors and of the international community. And when you have a regime that violates the basic standards of human rights, as this regime does, denies people basic expressions, beliefs, religious practices, things that we take for granted here in America and in other parts of the free world, you will never have a trusting partner in a nuclear agreement, in a missile agreement, on terrorism. These are all symptoms of the larger cancer that is the nature of the Islamic Republic. And while we will disagree on tactics and strategies of how to deal with that threat, and Republicans and Democrats might disagree on that right now, ultimately as Americans, I believe we always stand with the Iranian people. And we yearn for the day when they have their own hopes and dreams realized, that they have a government that represents their interests, that really reflects their vision for where they want to take Iran in the future, economically, politically, that actually has respect for the basic dignity of human life. And if we can agree on those basic principles as Americans, and we can agree on that with some of our allies, then we'll always be able to keep our eye on the ball and not fall into rabbit holes like we're doing now. And so that's my hope going forward, that no matter who wins the presidential election, no matter what the media and different parties say about snapback, that Congress and others on a bipartisan basis look back at the last dedicated Iran sanctions law that we passed in late 2012, the Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act, and remember why we put freedom into that act. And remember what we said and pledged was the sense of Congress in a bill that passed overwhelmingly. And that was to dedicate ourselves to the promotion of a free and democratic Iran, where people have freedom, where people are able to live their lives with decency and respect. That is our hope for all mankind, and certainly our hope for the Islamic Republic. So thank you for listening.
Of course, thank you. I hope we all will be able to see such a beautiful day. It gets me kind of emotional for being. Oh, on behalf of Iranian Americans for Liberty, again, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and joining us today and for providing such beautiful insight into this complex topic. And we enjoyed our second forum with you and everyone else who joined us today. Have an amazing afternoon, and thank you so much again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course.